I'm Julie Cayley. I'm with the Severn Sound Environmental Association. I'm the executive director here, and I see people are still coming into the participants list, so I'm just going to get us started. So good afternoon, Anin, bon après-midi. I acknowledge that the land we know as the South Georgian Bay Lake Simcoe region is the traditional territory of many nations of Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, now known as the Chippewa Tri-Council, the Haudenosaunee, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. We recognize this land as part of several treaties, including the Williams Treaties, and is home to many Indigenous peoples and many citizens of the Métis Nation of Ontario. And we're grateful to these nations for the opportunity to settle here and share the land. And we respectfully acknowledge that we are the stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters, and that we continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure their health and integrity for generations to come. Thank you, miigwech, and merci. And welcome everyone to the second webinar of our series. The Severn Sound Environmental Association is your joint municipal service board with 8 municipal members being, as you can see here on the slide, Tiny, Tay, Georgian Bay, Severn, Springwater, Oro-Medonte, Midland, and Penetanguishene. And Severn Township, working with the SSEA, has worked with the Ministry of Environment, Parks and Recreation and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry to bring you a 3-part session on environmental permissions, approvals, and the provincial aggregates approval system. And today is the second volume in this series, the Aggregate Approvals 101. And we're really looking forward to hearing from our speakers today. So just a bit of housekeeping, how to ask questions. If you haven't pre-submitted questions, you are able to ask in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And if you want your question to remain anonymous, just please click the anonymous button before you submit it. So now I will pass to our Severn Sound Environmental Association board member, Mark Taylor from the Township of Severn. Mark.
Great. Thank you, Julie, and good afternoon, everyone. This is the second of 3 webinars being presented. The purpose of these sessions is to help municipal councils and staff understand the basics behind these approvals. Information gained here will help us assist businesses and communities to understand the importance of getting things done properly. This will also improve efficiency and will ensure a healthy community now and also future generations to come. That being said, then I'd like to ask Councillor Phil Brennan to introduce our guests online here today. Over to you, Phil.
Phil, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thought I hit that button. Thanks, Mark. We have 2 speakers today, and based on their descriptions, they're no strangers to the field. There are no strangers to work boots, and they obviously have experience both in operations and in policy. So we're lucky to have them. I will first introduce Shauna Richardson. She is an aggregate supervisor in the aggregate section of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. She has been working in the aggregates program in various roles, including inspector, specialist, and coordinator since 2014. She has a Master of Science in Planning from the University of Toronto and lives in Waterloo, Ontario with her family. She's riding shotgun from the presentation mostly. Our main presenter is James Bakker. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Geography from McMaster University and a Natural Resource Technician Diploma from Northern College. He's worked with MNRF since 2009 in the aggregates portfolio and is an Aggregate Resource Coordinator. He is currently living and working in Peterborough, Ontario. With that, take it away there, James.
Thank you. I'll share my screen and jump into the presentation here. So, Aggregate Approvals 101. Here's a bit of an outline. I'll start off touching base on the Aggregate Resources Act. We'll talk a little bit about the Agri Industry. We'll get into duty to consult with Indigenous communities. Then we'll jump into a life cycle of an aggregate site, everything from applying for a new application at the start through active operations that are out there now and then we'll briefly touch on amendments to existing licenses and permits and transfers and surrenders, which are all done through our aggregate section. And then I've got an appendix at the end with a few links and additional resources. So I should probably start off by mentioning that as of 2020, there was a bit of a change to the aggregate program for the ministry. That was when our aggregate section was created, and that was meant to centralize the approvals process. So prior to that, you would have dealt with aggregate technical specialists in different districts of M&R, and they would have dealt with the compliance and inspection side, as well as approvals, reviewing new applications through amendments, transfers, and surrenders. But as of 2020, that's been split into the two components. The districts will continue to look after the compliance side. Now it's integrated resource management technicians, as opposed to aggregate technical specialists that are doing the inspections and responding to complaints. And our aggregate section that Shauna and I are a part of would look after the approvals piece. So we'll start with the legislation. MNRF regulates pits and quarries in the province under the Aggregate Resources Act. Like I said, our aggregate section issues new licenses and permits and looks after any changes to those authorizations. And the district staff would be responsible for inspecting existing aggregate operations, responding to complaints, making sure they're following the rules appropriately, and that rehabilitation is carried out on sites. The map that I have on the right specifies areas that are designated under the Aggregate Resources Act. So the Act applies to the entire province for Crown land, but on private land, it only applies to areas that have been designated under the Act. And those are the portions that are in green. So basically North Bay, Sudbury, across to Sault Ste. Marie and south, all of that private land is designated under the Aggregate Resources Act. North of those areas, outside of Wawa and Thunder Bay, the ARA wouldn't apply on private land. And so any extraction may be required to follow municipal approvals. So what is aggregate? Generally, we're talking sand, gravel, and bedrock. It's important to note earth is included in aggregate, but earth does not include topsoil and peat. So if someone wants to extract peat, it's not covered under the Aggregate Resources Act. And topsoil, it's not covered in the same way because topsoil is meant to be kept on site for rehabilitation of the site prior to surrendering the license. So for the purposes of the ARA, aggregate does not cover materials like metals, gold, silver, copper. Those sorts of things are covered under the Mining Act, and that's administered by Ministry of Mines. There's also certain types of rock that aren't covered under the Aggregate Resources Act. So in the legislation and our regulation, it has a bit more detail as to which rocks are included and which aren't. And for the examples below, things like salt and coal, that's not included under the Aggregate Resources Act. And anything that isn't generally is covered under the Mining Act instead with Ministry of Mines. So on the right side, I have a few pictures. We will issue approvals for pits or quarries. And I should say it could also be a pit and quarry. So a pit would be when they're extracting any loose material, sand and gravel. They can do that with an excavator or a loader. A quarry is for bedrock. So granite, limestone, marble, anything that generally needs to either have drilling and blasting or cutting of the stone to remove. And so I should also clarify that for the authorizations we would issue for extraction, it's either a license or a permit being on Crown land, and a license is required for private land. So a bit of layout here. The Aggregate Resources Act is the overarching legislation, provides the framework that we're working within. Beneath that, you have the regulation 24497. It goes a bit more in depth. It has standard conditions that we would add to licenses and permits that are issued. It has operational conditions for operators to follow. It lays out reporting deadlines, mentions the fees that are required, that sort of things. Beneath the regulation, we have the Aggregate Resources of Ontario standards. This is important. This is something that's been updated in 2021. And a lot of it relates to new license and permit applications. They'll have site plan standards, there's technical report and information standards, circulation standards, and the final one is amendment standards. And the amendment standards deal specifically with above to below water changes to an operation, and also expanding into an adjacent road allowance, which is the only time that a license or permit boundary can expand through an amendment as opposed to a new application. But we'll talk about those in more detail below. And then so under that, we also have policies and procedures that help guide our day-to-day business. I should mention that they're sort of under review and being updated now. Our aggregate section is working a lot on the procedures, and we have a policy division within M&RF that is working on the policy side of it. And you may have even seen recently there was an amendment policy that was posted on the environmental registry for comment. That's since closed, but it's just showing that policy division is working to push those things forward. So now I'll touch on lightly on the aggregate industry. Currently out there in the landscape, we have over 6,000 authorizations. Those are the licenses and permits that have been approved and are currently operating. That's split roughly into 3,600 licenses on private land and 2,500 permits on Crown land. I should also mention that out of those 2,500 permits, about 500 or 600, I think, are actually issued to Ministry of Transportation. So they have the ability under the Aggregate Resources Act to issue their own permits for public road projects. So for maintaining and constructing 400 series highways, that sort of thing. So about 10% of those 6,000 operations have an active request with our section at any time, meaning an amendment to the existing site or a new application that we're reviewing, also the transfers and surrenders that I touched on. And up to about 60% of aggregates that are used in the province are used by used for municipal, provincial, and federal projects. Currently, there's about 165 million tons of aggregate used every year, and about 50% of that is brought into the GTA or within the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And municipalities receive about 61% of the aggregate fees that are generated each year. There's a few statistics on the bottom that an average brick home takes about 250 tons of aggregate, which is about 12 truckloads, and 1 kilometer of two-lane roadway uses about 17,000 tons or 863 truckloads. I'll just touch briefly on the Agri Resources Corporation. This is a arm's length agency of M&R established in 1997. They're responsible for the collection of the fees that are owing from aggregate operators that produce each year. They are also responsible for the rehabilitation of abandoned pits and quarries. Abandoned pits and quarries quickly are ones that when the Aggregate Resources Act came into effect in an area, operators were given the opportunity to either apply for a license or stop digging. And if they chose to stop digging, then that went to TORC to have the responsibility to rehabilitate those sites. And also, if we have current sites out there where the compliance issues are bad enough that the ministry looks to revoke the license or permit, that would also fall to TORC to do the rehabilitation. They have a number of production statistics that are posted on their website. I'd encourage you to have a look. They also have an e-surrender database. So that's a good way to see what sites previously existed in your area that may have been surrendered since then. So they have a multi-stakeholder board of directors. OSGA's on that board of directors. OSGA is the Ontario Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association, and they represent a number of aggregate operators that are out on the landscape. And we work closely together because they look after the fees, and we need to update them on any changes to our authorizations, like when we transfer a site to a new operator or surrender one finally. So we'll get into the life cycle of an aggregate site. This is a flow chart that's available on our website, breaking down the different stages of a license or permit application. So when someone wants to apply for a new license or permit, it's very much a proponent-driven process. They have to ensure before even submitting to M&RF that they've been following the requirements of the different standards. So the site plan standards. Anyone that wants to apply for a license or permit, they have to produce a site plan. The site plan could be a 1-page document. Typically it's 3 pages, could be quite a bit more. And generally it shows how the site's going to be operated and how it's going to be rehabilitated. So details on depth of extraction, setbacks that are included, any monitoring or mitigation that are required, that all needs to that all needs to be placed on the site plan so that we can inspect it down the road and make sure they're following the rules. The technical report and information standards lays out the different reporting that's required to support an application. I'll go into that in a little bit more depth later. And the circulation standards, basically identifying who they need to consult with for the application. So it is the applicant's responsibility to do the appropriate consultation with public agencies, municipalities, other ministries. And it's also a requirement of the regulation for them to attempt to resolve concerns that were raised during the application process. They have to document all of the consultation that they've done and share that with M&R for review before the end of the process. And it's really important to flag that M&R is unable to issue a license on private land unless they first have permissive zoning for that property. So as far as the ministry's role as it relates to new license and permit applications, we have a dual role. One is to make sure that they're following the appropriate process. So making sure that they're doing the appropriate consultation, that they've submitted the right reports, that they've made sufficient attempts to resolve concerns, things like that. And then on the other side, we'll also review the proposal and comment from our own mandated interests and programs. So on our aggregate section team, there's about 30 of us now. We have a planner, we have planning ecologists, we have a hydrogeologist, and a number of aggregate specialists. And they'll review the reports and the site plans and comment if they think there's any deficiencies in what's been submitted. And the final line there talks about, we also have the requirement for the duty to consult with Indigenous communities. This component is something that the aggregate section will rely on district staff. There's resource liaison specialists, and it's their role to maintain that relationship with the Indigenous communities within their district. So they'll advise us and the proponent as to what consultation may be required. And our aggregate section will make sure they're satisfied before we can move forward in issuing any authorization. So what does the applicant submit to the ministry? Right off the bat, to start the process, we'll need a completed site plan that's been done as per the site plan standards. We'll need a summary statement, which has, depending on the application that they're submitting, it has a number of different information components that they need to speak to, which could be zoning of the property, could be source water protection, haul routes, suitability of rehabilitation. There's a few different components on there, depending on the type of application. And I should mention, when I say depending on the type of application, that I mean license versus permit, pit versus quarry, and above the water table extraction or below the water table. And then the other component would be Class A or Class B license. And the difference there is a Class B license allows for 20,000 tons a year of aggregate to be removed from the site or less. A Class A is anything over 20,000 tons a year. And that can go all the way to unlimited if that's what they propose and if that's what makes it to the end of the application process. So as far as technical reporting requirements, every application, all of the ones that I mentioned already, they need a natural environment report. This assesses the natural environment features on the property and within 120 meters of the site. So we're talking significant woodlands, wetlands, valley lands, if present, habitat of endangered and threatened species, fish habitat, those sorts of things. They also need a maximum predicted water table report. So that requires a year's worth of water monitoring, and it's meant to tell us where the water table is compared to their depth of extraction. And so when I mentioned above the water table versus below, if they are proposing to stay above the water table for a pit, they must stay 1.5 meters above that maximum predicted water table level. For a quarry, it's 2 meters above. If they are proposing below water extraction, they also have to do a water report. So a level 1 determines the potential for impacts. And then if there is potential for impacts, the level 2 is an impact assessment where it identifies the extent of the potential impact and also lays out what sort of mitigation needs to be proposed. And that mitigation needs to make its way onto the site plan so that it's enforceable. Towards the bottom here, they also have to submit a cultural heritage report. So that can start out with checklists filled out by the proponent. And if the checklists identify any potential for features to be on site, and we're talking about archaeology, built heritage, cultural landscape, then the checklist may have a trigger for reports to be required. And that would mean an archaeological report stage 1 through 4, potentially, depending on the features that are on site. And there's also cultural heritage reporting requirements, potentially, depending on what's there. So these are the last bits of the technical reports. There's an agricultural impact assessment. That's if their application is in a prime agricultural area, and if they're within a provincial plan area that generally requires this type of report. So if they're within the Oak Ridges Moraine, Greenbelt, Greater Growth Plan, or Niagara Escarpment Plan, that's when those studies would have to be submitted in support of an application. A noise assessment report may have to be submitted, but that's specifically if there's a sensitive receptor within 150 meters of a pit, or if the application is within 500 meters, or if there's a sensitive receptor within 500 meters of a quarry, then that report has to show that they can meet the provincial noise guidelines. And a sensitive receptor is any place where a person sleeps, is how it's spoken to in our regulation. And so finally, there may also be a blast design report. That's for quarries specifically, and those that produce over 20,000 tons a year. So the Class A license or permits over that tonnage. And that is also specifically if there's a sensitive receptor within 500 meters. And again, that report has to show that provincial guidelines can be met for noise and vibration. And so there's a note at the bottom that just says all technical reports have to be done by the appropriate qualified person, and those qualifications have to be provided in the report. So just before I get into this one, all of the studies and the site plan and the summary statement that I mentioned on the previous slide, the start of the process is the applicant submitting that to MNRF for review. And that's what's called a deemed complete stage. So we'll have 25 days to review that package and say whether or not it meets the Ontario standards, the site plan technical report standards. And it is less of a quality review as it is more of a checklist to say, did you submit what was required? Because later in the consultation process, that's when we'll look at it more under a microscope and let the applicant know if we have any concerns with what was submitted. So if, say, they didn't submit one of the reports that are required, it could be deemed incomplete, sent back to the applicant, and then they have to address the deficiencies before they can resubmit to M&R. If we deem it complete, that's when they can move on to the notification and consultation stage, which is also led by the applicant. So this is where they have to do their reach out to the folks that are listed in the circulation standards, and also our regulation has some direction on who they need to consult with. So typically this is notifying landowners within 120 meters of the proposed boundary. They have to publish a notice in the local newspaper. Now there's also the ability to do an online news source. They post a sign on the property, and they have to send a copy of the application to those in the circulation standards, which I'll describe a little bit more on the next slide. They also have to host a public information session. A lot of those are done virtually these days and since COVID. So the consultation period lasts for 60 days. This is one of the changes that came about in 2021. Prior to 2021, it was a 45-day comment period for licenses, and it could be anywhere from a 20 to 30-day comment period for permits. But now it's 60 across the board. And the important piece here is that anyone that has comments on the application would need to submit them in writing to both the applicant and MNRF within those 60 days to be considered an official commenter and involved in the process. And that's important because the way it's laid out in the reg is that anyone that comments and follows that process within the 60 days, the applicant is required to attempt to address the concerns that are raised. And it's also important to note that it's not just the landowners within 120 or those circulated that have the ability to comment. It's anyone that was made aware of the application during the 60 days. Anyone is welcome to comment on this. And I should also say, for license applications on private land, M&R also has the obligation to post a notice on the Environmental Registry of Ontario. And so that's posted for 60 days as well. And it's just another opportunity allowing the public or anyone really that has an interest to review some details on the application and submit comments. The slight difference there is that anything submitted through the Environmental Registry is for MNRF's consideration. So it's not necessarily required for the applicant to address the concerns raised through the registry. It's for M&R to consider. So this slide talks a little bit about the circulation standards that I had mentioned. There is one line at the top I should explain, talks about aggregate license permit or wayside permit. Wayside permits are another authorization we deal with. I didn't mention it up front because we have so few currently in the process. Wayside permit is for public authority contracts, and it has an 18-month time limit. So they must be finished within 18 months. So that's why we only have a handful in the process at any time. The bulk, 99% of our authorizations are licenses or permits. So for the circulation standards for a license or permit application, each one has to be circulated to local and regional municipality for their review and comment. We get into a few other ones here. I won't go through every bullet explaining why certain ones are circulated or not, but generally it's the Conservation Authority, OMAFRA, if there was an agricultural impact assessment, Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and the main piece there is if there's habitat of endangered or threatened species, because the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, went to Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks for administration, so they'll look after that component. And if it's a below water application and there was a level 2 water report completed. A few more on this next slide. Ministry of Transportation for all aggregate permit applications on Crown land. This next ministry, the name has changed. Ministry of Culture also gets circulated in some instances. DFO, if there's potential for impacts to fish habitat. Niagara Escarpment Commission, if it's within the Niagara Escarpment Plan area. Utility owners, if there's a corridor. Ministry of Mines for permits on Crown land. And then forest companies as directed by MNRF, and for aggregate permits specifically, anyone that uses Crown land on or nearby that site. So that's, in a nutshell, what the circulation standards directs. There's a quick slide on duty to consult here with Indigenous communities. So there was a piece added to the Act in 2017 that requires the minister to consider whether adequate consultation with Aboriginal communities has been consulted or has been carried out before exercising any power under the Act. And generally, I had mentioned before, we work with the resource liaison specialist in the district to figure out what consultation requirements are needed. And a lot of that, generally from what I've seen, gets delegated to the proponent to try and address. And I think a lot of that is because they are best suited to explain the application to whichever Indigenous communities are interested. And they're also in the best opportunity to provide any accommodation that may be needed if required. And so the consultation requirements can be different from one community to the next, but we rely heavily on the district RLS to help out the aggregate section on that piece. And so we won't move an application forward until we've got confirmation from the district staff that the duty to consult has been addressed. So addressing comments. When we pass that 60-day consultation timeframe, any comments that have been received by the applicant and MNR, it is the applicant's responsibility to attempt to address those concerns. For a license application, there is currently a 2-year timeline for them to try and work with anybody that's raised concerns. For permits, it's a 6-month timeline, but permits has the ability to be extended if they need more time to complete their consultation. So if at the end of the 2 years, say for a license application process, there are outstanding concerns, meaning that members of the public or municipalities, anyone that had comments, if they haven't written in to say that the attempts by the proponent have addressed their concerns and they're being withdrawn, then the applicant sends them an objection form. And the objection form allows those commenters 20 days to sort of reaffirm that no, our concerns have not been addressed and we would like to continue on as an objector. And this is important for the license application process because at the end of that 2-year timeline, the applicant will submit a consultation package to MNR for review showing what occurred related to consultation, what attempts have been made to address concerns, and what concerns remain outstanding. And MNR has 40 days at that point to review the package and either recommend approving the application, recommend refusing to issue, or referring a license application to the Ontario Land Tribunal for a hearing. So for a new license application, it's the minister that would have to sign off on the new license. For permits on Crown land, it's delegated to our director. And there is a slight difference on the permit piece that there isn't the use of the objection form. Whatever comments remain outstanding at the end of the process are submitted in that consultation package, and M&R will review and determine whether or not there's appropriate mitigation for the concerns that have been raised. And it wouldn't be referred to the Ontario Land Tribunal. It's up to the director to make a decision on that, the final permit issuance or refusal. For licenses with the Ontario Land Tribunal, I would say generally, if there are outstanding concerns at the end of the process, we've been referring it to the Ontario Land Tribunal. And this does tend to extend the time period a little bit because the Ontario Land Tribunal is busy as well. But in the end, the tribunal will have a hearing and they will direct the minister to either issue the license, issue it with conditions, or refuse to issue. And that's what we would end up doing as per the direction of the OLT. And then to round it out, we'll post a decision notice on the environmental registry to say what decision has been made. So I'll get into active operations a little bit. This is more with the district staff, the integrated resource management technicians. They're responsible for doing inspections of the 6,000 sites that we have out there currently. They take a risk management approach to the inspections that they do. Every year, the licensees and permittees that are out on the landscape are required to submit compliance assessment reports. That is a self-assessment that they do to let us know whether or not they're operating in compliance with their site plan and the rules of their license or permit. They get submitted to the district office for the IRMs to review, and depending on the information that's included, it may trigger them to do an inspection. And I should say that those compliance assessment reports also are intended to get shared with the local and regional municipalities every year as well. License and permit holders also have to report every year on the production from their sites. So they submit an annual production report to TORC. That's by the end of January, it's due. And then based on what they've reported, they have to pay the annual fees or royalties by March 15th. So the fees are required on every license and permit, and that's an annual fee or an amount per ton that's extracted, whichever is greater. When I talk about royalties, that is when they're extracting Crown-owned aggregate. So on Crown land, then they pay an additional amount because it's Crown material as opposed to private land material that they are removing. So the district IRMs, they have a number of options that they can do to get compliance on a site. Generally, we start with inspection reports, would be their first sort of tactic, which is identifying whatever compliance issues they found and then giving them a time frame to try and address them. That can move up to suspension, potentially rehabilitation orders if there isn't enough rehabilitation completed on site. And then it can go all the way to charges under the Act, or potentially what I mentioned before about license or permit revocation. That would be worst case scenario, and that's for continued non-compliance, significant non-compliance. And if the license and permit or permit is revoked, or like ultimately yanked from the proponent, then it gets handed over to TORC to look after the rehabilitation of that site. But again, that is final step, worst case scenario. And so the majority of the sites that we have in the process or in the province now, the 6,000, they're in this stage of active operation. So digging and rehabilitating as per the direction of their site plan, license, or permit. So we'll talk a little bit about amending an existing license or permit. So for us, that's generally split into minor amendments or significant amendments. Minor amendments are, in our opinion, small scale, low potential for impact. We've got examples in our policy and procedure. One example would be if there's a rehabilitated portion of the site or an unextracted portion of the site, they may be able to surrender a piece. We call it a partial surrender. Something like revising tree species or what type of vegetative cover they're going to have on the site. We've also considered that as a minor amendment. And a lot of these things could be administrative amendments as well. So if they want to change a mailing address or the name of a company, minor amendments generally don't require circulation or consultation. And it's something that it's delegated to Katie O'Connell, our manager in the aggregate section. And we do quite a few of these fairly regularly. Significant amendments, on the other hand, are bigger scale, bigger changes to operations or rehabilitation. Generally, it's our aggregate specialists that make that call on whether it's minor or significant. But we also have lists in our policies and procedures that help us decide what's minor and what's significant. Before 2021, you would have heard these referred to as major amendments. If an amendment is deemed to be significant, then there is consultation that's required. And generally, again, this is with the local regional municipality every time. There may be other ministries, other agencies that are involved in that consultation. It may be landowners within a certain distance, but it depends entirely on what's requested to change. And so for significant amendments to aggregate licenses and their site plans, those are also required to be posted on the environmental registry for additional public consultation. And the ministry takes care of that posting. So there's a couple examples below, common examples of significant amendments that we see: increasing the maximum allowable tonnage. So the maximum amount of material that can be removed from the site every year. That's every time a significant amendment requiring consultation. If they're proposing significant changes to the rehabilitation plan, this could be like importation of fill, changing the grades, the proposed grades that are on site, and changing from an above water operation to a below water operation is also a significant amendment. And that one was recently changed, I believe, as of 2021, maybe a little earlier, that it actually can be referred to the Ontario Land Tribunal now. And it's very similar almost to a new application in terms of the amount of consultation that's required to go through with that process. So I'm going to touch a bit on self-filed amendments. This is something that started in 2020. They are minor amendments, again, small scale, low impact, that can be submitted by operators and don't actually need formal approval. So the idea is if they meet a number of pre-existing conditions, then they can submit revised site plans, and it's an automatic approval if the conditions are met. And once they've submitted it, those revised site plans are also to be shared with the local and regional municipality. So when the changes first came out in 2020, there's a list here of what was eligible for self-filing. So things like updating a name and contact after they transferred a license, the name and contact information on the site plan, I mean. They could change the type of fencing. They could add, remove, or relocate temporary buildings or structures. And it's important to note that these are incidental to the operation. Generally, we're talking scales and scale house, that sort of thing. They could have small scrap storage areas. They could move around stockpiles of aggregate, topsoil, overburden, or recycled aggregate if they were already permitted to have that material on the site. And then shifting internal haul routes within the site. And there was one more on the bottom there about importing aggregate for blending or resale, but they were limited to whatever they bring in plus the material that they're removing from that site couldn't exceed their annual tonnage limit. So I should note that just recently in the last few months, there were new additions to this self-filed list, and they now include recycling, portable processing equipment, entrances, portable asphalt and concrete plants, and fuel storage. But I should stress that there are a number of conditions that need to be met before they can add these through self-filing. They're all in our regulation. And for example, in relation to recycling, they need to have the appropriate permissive zoning on the property before they can add recycling as a self-filed amendment. And similar for portable processing equipment, I believe it has to be included in their zoning. For things like entrances, there has to be previous approval in place from the road authority, be that the local or regional municipality or MTO in some cases. In regards to portable asphalt concrete plants, that is only for a public authority contract and only for that duration where they can use that equipment. And fuel storage must be in line with source water protection considerations. in terms of where they can have fuel storage on site. There's also other limits on the amount of fuel and that it can't be below ground. So there's quite a few conditions that are listed there. Just coming up on the last few slides here, briefly about transferring an existing license or permit. So this is for the most part an administrative process from our end. And part of the reason for that is that even though the license may change hands, the new licensee or permittee is still required to follow all of the existing site plan, license, or permit conditions. It's just that it's a different operator on the site. So a lot of times this happens because an operator decides they wish to sell the property and maybe they no longer want to deal with aggregate extraction, or they're moving on to other projects. So someone new can buy the property and have the license transferred. And like I mentioned, it's a fairly administrative process for the most part. And then, so surrendering a license permit, another thing that our aggregate section would take care of, that is once the site has been extracted of all marketable material and they've done the rehabilitation as per the direction of the site plan, M&R will also have to do an inspection of the site to make sure that that rehab's been completed. That would be the district IRM that would be doing that. As long as there are no outstanding fees or reports, M&R can surrender the license or permit. And once the license or permit is surrendered, there's no more obligation for the operator under the Aggregate Resources Act. They would move forward with that property like any other property at that point. So I got a few additional resources here at the end. There's a link to the Aggregate Resources Act, our regulation. M&RF's website, I find, has a lot of useful information in there. There's an aggregate tab. I mentioned that the fees that are updated every year because of inflation, those are listed on our website as well. And the portions that go to the municipality, the upper tier, M&RF, and the MAP program. There's also a link to Pits and Quarries Online, which is a website I find really helpful. It shows every site that's currently licensed and permitted across the province. And you can either search by license or permit number if you're aware of it, or you can zoom into specific geographical areas that you want to see, and it'll show you the boundaries of the existing sites. It has information on what the size is of the site, whether they're allowed to extract above or below water. It tells you who the licensee or permittee is, what their annual tonnage is. So there's a lot of information there, and I find that really helpful. And there's a link here to Torque's website as well. A lot of publications about statistics related to aggregate extraction. So broken down by year, broken down by townships, broken down by M&R districts, a lot of information there. And then finally, the best way to get a hold of us, ARA Approvals at ontario.ca if there's any inquiries, and then that gets distributed out to the rest of the team, whoever's most appropriate to answer it. I just have one reference there that Katie O'Connell is the manager of our aggregate section. We have two supervisors currently, Shauna and Kim. And if you had any questions, you could always forward them to me as well, if you like. But that's the end of my presentation. So I think I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, James. So we have time for some questions here. And as you know, we had some that were submitted beforehand. And you may have covered them in your presentation, but if you don't mind, maybe just an opportunity to go back to some of the facts that you've presented. So the first question we have is, in terms of aggregate, I'd like to know what sort of water quality and quantity testing M&RF requires before granting approvals before a pit is approved and during its operation.
So I would say the main piece relates to that maximum predicted water table report that has to be submitted for every application. So it's less so quality and more depth to the groundwater table. The maximum predicted water table report, they do have to do a year's worth of water monitoring before they can submit the report to M&RF. It does have to be done by a qualified professional. And it depends a lot on what type of application was submitted, because if it is an above water application, the max predicted water table is sufficient. If it is below water, then that's when they do the water report level 1 and level 2, and they're assessing what potential there is for impacts, and any mitigation that they're proposing would be included in the site plans as well.
Great, thank you. And so the second question was more around groundwater, which I think you've just covered, the groundwater monitoring data that's required. And would that then also apply to an operation expansion before it's granted? Do they require groundwater monitoring data?
They do. So again, through those same reports, and I should clarify, I guess, when we're talking about an expansion to an existing site, from our perspective, that is like a brand new application, like any other brand new application. So it'd be similar requirements each time. And when we're talking about groundwater monitoring, I guess I should flag that there's a couple of different ways that that can be brought up. So it's either through the recommendations of those reports that I mentioned. So the QP that puts together the reports may have recommended monitoring. And the way our regulation is written is that any of those recommendations need to make their way onto the site plan, so they're enforceable. The other way things like monitoring can come up are through the comments submitted on an application. And so I'd say it varies quite a bit from one application to the next, because say a pit application that's above water, say there's no natural features next door, no streams, creeks, rivers, wetlands, there may be less potential for impact compared to, say, a below water quarry that is surrounded by sensitive receptors adjacent to PSWs, right? There may be a different scale of potential impacts. So I've seen smaller reports, I've seen larger reports, and some new applications I've seen have adaptive management plans attached, binders like this thick, that will have all kinds of triggers and all kinds of requirements for monitoring and potential mitigation, depending on the scrutiny for that application.
Great, thank you. So more to follow on that type of question. How do you know if the approval criteria is working or sufficient relative to groundwater monitoring post-approval?
So I can say a lot of applications that had a lot of scrutiny regarding impacts to groundwater or surface water features, if they end up having those monitoring requirements through the reports that get added to the site plan, more often than not, there is the requirement to supply that monitoring to MNRF at a minimum. So the QP that does the annual monitoring that's included on the site plan, an annual report will come into MNRF supplied by a QP, and they will have an assessment in there of everything is okay so far, or they might say, we think there may be the potential for impacts based on where the monitoring has been going. And sometimes they may propose additional mitigation, which could be added to the site plan through an amendment, potentially. But it's the QP that sort of compiles this annual monitoring, if it's required on the site plan, and submits it to MNR for review, usually once a year. And depending on the comments that came in through the application, sometimes I've seen these annual monitoring reports have to be shared with MECP as well, sometimes with the town and county, if that was an interest that was flagged through the application.
Okay.
James, can I just add one thing?
Sure.
A lot of these plans will have, so beyond the annual monitoring, trigger thresholds put in place. So part of the mitigation will be, listen, this is a temperature variation in a certain monitoring well that if we hit that trigger threshold, immediate action needs to be taken with responding action. So beyond just the monitoring, there's embedded like trigger thresholds that they need to comply with on their plan. So as they continually monitor, and depending on the sophistication of the plan, sometimes it's almost like daily levels they're getting. It really varies across the province, but there are built-in trigger thresholds. So we know as soon as typically those thresholds are at a low enough point that the damage isn't done, right? They're slightly lower than like a well going dry or whatever other impact to natural heritage. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. Sorry, James.
No problem.
Thank you. And so just a reminder, a QP is a qualified person, is that right? And that's defined under your regulation.
Yes, that's right.
Great. All right. And more monitoring question. What if it's an abnormally low year? Is there a mechanism to utilize longer term data if it exists?
I would say there's potential for that. I think we rely a lot on the QP that has done the monitoring and put together their assessment. But I think if there's complications, we also have a hydrogeologist on our staff that will be reviewing their recommendations. And I have seen it before where they say, precipitation has been low for a few years. We don't actually think that these potential impacts are tied to extraction. We recommend more monitoring, or they will have different recommendations generally in the report. And then if we review and agree with the findings, then we can move forward based on that.
Thank you. Another question that had come in beforehand, with the increase in housing and development in the province, is there an increase in pressure and demand for aggregate? Do you see permits as the increase in permits and aggregate extraction permits?
I think there was a big jump in applications coming in leading up to the 2021 changes. There's quite a few applications that are under review right now, but I think it's not necessarily just an increase in applications for new sites. There could also be amendments to increase tonnage on existing sites, or altering setbacks on sites to get at more material, or amendments to go deeper. So I think there's a few different avenues, not just new applications, for people to try and get an additional aggregate. Whether there's been a big influx lately, I don't know. I think it's been fairly steady.
Yeah, I think we have 150 active applications on the go right now, but yeah, there is a substantial quantity of capacity in the existing sites that is also picking up some of that demand, right? So I think the figure we stated in this presentation is kind of an average, 165. I think last year it was 168 million tones. So again, there's been an increase, so you can see that, but yeah, a lot of that is likely coming from the existing permit license pool of the existing sites. So
okay. Who is responsible for licensing water extraction in Oromadonti?
Water extraction, like extraction of aggregate beneath the water table?
It says licensing for water extraction. So
that might be referring to dewatering or permits to take water, which would be Ministry of Environment. I know you guys had a fantastic presentation from the approvals branch of MECP. So that would be an MECP instrument. Any dewatering or would require a permit to take water on site. So pits and quarries so again, the Agri Resources Act kind of licenses the activity on site, but there are many other approvals that are needed to help an operation run depending on the activities on site. So dewatering would require MECP instruments. Same with like any discharge off site requires an ECA from MECP, right? So depending on the activities on site, there are a list of other approvals that can be tacked on top of their ARA approval. So hopefully all of you have had the opportunity to view that MECP presentation, because we're not the expert, but I know it was really well done. So
great, thank you. And I assume that would apply then for like wash water, if they're using wash water. So any taking of water would fall within that. Great.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trigger for, is it 10,000 liters a day? 50. I also don't know the number. So again, I'm not the expert, but there is like a cutoff of where one's required.
Great, thank you. I think you may have answered this in your presentation, how are district offices involved in the process now?
District offices are very much the lead for compliance. So that is the IRM staff now, as opposed to previously it was aggregate technical specialists. So the IRMs, will rely on them for a few different inspection requirements. So before we surrender a site, we would need to ask the district IRMs to do an inspection to make sure that the rehabilitation is completed. And the resource liaison specialists that have that relationship with the different Indigenous communities. That's the other main component of where we'll rely on district staff to get their opinion on what's required in regards to duty to consult, not just related to new license permit applications, but amendments as well in some cases. So I think that's the two main reasons we would rely on them for what we do in the aggregate section, but the IRMs are definitely leading the compliance component. So regular inspections of existing sites, and then also responding to complaints. That definitely sits with the district staff.
Great, thank you. And sorry, did you also say they're doing the restoration plan follow-ups?
Yeah, well, the surrender. So before we can let go a site, we need to make sure that all the rehabilitation has been completed as per the direction of the site plan. And generally that's like in a pit, it would have to be 3-to-1 side slopes, topsoil and greened up, and in a quarry 2-to-1 side slopes. And each rehabilitation plan might be a little bit different from one to the next, depending if it's above water, below water extraction, if there's tree planting required. But the district IRMs are really our eyes in the field to say, yes, the rehab looks good, or no, there's more that's required. So we really rely on them for doing those site inspections.
Great, thank you. We have one last question that's come in the Q&A, and that's, we've heard from many Indigenous partners that they're overwhelmed with requests related to duty to consult. How is MNRF, or how do you recommend the proponents handle this challenge? In other words, no response from a community may not mean they have no concerns, just that they don't have the resources to comment. So yeah, not just how do you handle it, or do you have thoughts on how to handle the challenge? Because it sounds like we're all facing that.
That is a bit tricky. I know if any proponents were asking me about that, I would say exactly how you said that, one reach out without a response. I don't know that that necessarily takes care of the duty to consult requirement. So I think I would always recommend multiple reach outs. I do know in some cases, even though our ministry, for the most part, delegates the procedural aspects of duty to consult to the proponents because they are in the best position to explain their application, there are some instances where our ministry might either lead it or provide more support in some cases, depending on the needs of the Indigenous community. So I think for any proponents that may have questions or maybe having a hard time, or Indigenous communities as well, I think reaching out to that RLS in the district to sort of, ask what can be done to help out is always a good first step.
Great, thank you, James. So I think we're going to wrap up. I don't see any more questions that have come in the Q&A. Thank you very much for your time. You've both done a great job, I think, at answering our questions, and a really fulsome presentation, and very much appreciate that. And I'm going to pass it on to Phil. Phil, if you've got a few final words.
Yes, thank you. To Shauna and James, that was fantastic. And I'm so glad that you're allowing us to hang on to the presentation. There's so much fascinating detail and important detail in there. So well done. It's an interesting business that you're in. I also want to say to our people out there that there will be a short survey that will pop up as you exit, and this is the first time we've done this. My view is that there's nothing like this provided by AMO. We don't, these particular presentations of provincial responsibility. It's hard to get this information, and you can see just from James's comments, just changes as recently as this year. He spoke of a number of changes. So we think this kind of thing, is maybe something we should do every year or two or whatever. We would like your views on that. What are we doing right here today? What would you might want us to add or do differently? We would appreciate your comments very much so. A lot of work goes in by the presenters, and in this particular case, SIA has been a marvelous partner and done a lot of work, and we just want to make sure that it's useful, and maybe we should be expanding this. We'll see where we go. Everything does keep changing. I just want to emphasize that, but you can't sort of sit in a presentation like this one year and then 2 years expect it to be the same. There's just so much going on out there, and it's great for us to keep up. So I hope to see everyone at our next session on October 12th, which is regarding environmental assessments. You may be more impacted by those things in terms of getting your provincial projects off the ground than you realize. The presenter in that case is the program manager, Jelko Romick, and he is definitely knows the game he's in very well. He's been at it for quite a while. And that's about it. That's all I have to say, except again, I want to say thank you to our presenters. Thank you, Julie, and your great team. Thank you, Mark, for making the connections.
Great. Thank you, everyone.